In this lecture, we will discuss the voltage source and the current source. In the previous lecture, we discussed that there are two types of elements within any electrical or electronic circuit. These are the active elements and the passive elements. Now, what are active elements? An active element is one that is capable of continuously supplying energy to a circuit such as a battery, a generator, an operational amplifier, etc. Whereas a passive element is such type of element which cannot generate electrical energy by themselves, but they can only consume the electrical energy. And examples of passive elements are resistors, inductors, capacitors, etc. The type of the active circuit elements that are most important to us are those that supply the electrical energy to the circuit or the network which is connected to them. These are called the electrical sources, and there are two types of electrical sources. The first one is the voltage source and the second one is the current source. So we can say that there are two types of electrical sources. The first one is the voltage source and the second one is the current source. We will be discussing both these types of sources one by one. So as we have seen earlier that the voltage source and the current source are active elements. A voltage source is a type of electrical source. So we can say that the voltage sources are those devices that provide voltage to a circuit. A voltage source is a device which provides constant voltage across its terminals irrespective of the load connected to it. So we can say that the purpose of a voltage source is to provide voltage to the circuit rather than current. And there are two types of voltage sources in any electrical networks. The first one is the ideal voltage source and the second one is the practical voltage source. Now, what is an ideal voltage source? An ideal voltage source is a voltage source which will provide constant voltage across its terminals. Such type of source will have zero internal resistance. That is, an ideal voltage source will have zero internal resistance so that there is no voltage drop across the internal resistance, and the voltage across its terminals is the same as the voltage of that voltage source. Practically, no sources are ideal voltage source. Now, what is a practical voltage source? A practical voltage source is a voltage source which will have some internal resistance connected to it so that the voltage obtained across its terminals is less than the voltage of that voltage source. The practical voltage sources are also called real voltage sources. So we can say that in practice, no sources are ideal. That is, there is no source which can be called an ideal voltage source. Now we will see what do we mean by current source. The current sources are also active network elements, as we have seen earlier. So we can say that a current source is an active element which will provide the same, that is constant current to any load which is connected to it. Or we can say that the purpose of a current source is to provide current to a circuit rather than voltage. And just like the voltage source Current source can also be classified into two types. The first one is the ideal current source and the second one is the practical current source. And as we have said earlier, practically no source is there which can be called an ideal current source. So we can say that an ideal current source is a current source which will provide constant current, and such a type of current source will have infinite internal resistance. That is, an ideal current source is a current source which will have infinite internal resistance. Similarly, practical current source is a current source which will have a very large value of internal resistance connected to it. So we can say that a current source is an active circuit element which is capable of supplying a constant current flow in a circuit irrespective of the value of the voltage developed across its terminals. That is, a current source is a source which will provide constant current to any circuit. And examples of current source are LED current source, constant current diode, etc. Similarly, we can say that a voltage source is a device which generates an exact output voltage which does not change regardless of the load current. That is, a voltage source is a device which will provide constant voltage in any circuit. And some of the examples of voltage source are battery, generator, etc. In the next lecture, we will discuss the two types of the voltage and the current source, that is the ideal and the practical voltage and the current source.